The gas light had been on for longer than I wanted to admit. I kept telling myself I'd make it to the next town, that I'd see the glow of a gas station sign any moment now. But the road stretched on, endless and barren, the horizon swallowed by darkness. Arizona highways at night are a different kind of isolation, the kind that makes you feel like the last person left on Earth. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour, and the farther I drove, the more I realized just how empty this place was. No streetlights, no road signs, not even a reflective marker to break up the black void around me. Just an unbroken stretch of asphalt cutting through the desert. I glanced at my phone. No service. Figures. The engine sputtered. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, but when I pressed the gas, nothing happened. The car slowed, rolling forward like a dying animal taking its last steps. A final, choke sound came from under the hood, and then nothing. Silence. I coasted to the shoulder of the road and sat there, gripping the wheel. Great. I turned the key. The engine coughed, but didn't turn over. Tried again. Nothing. I was officially stranded. For a while, I just sat there, staring out at the empty highway ahead. My headlights cut through the dark, but there was nothing to see. Just more road disappearing into the night. I tried my phone again, even held it up out the window like an idiot, but the screen still read no service. I wasn't sure why I thought that would change. I checked the time. 12:17 a.m. Someone would come along. Eventually, right? With nothing else to do, I switched off the headlights to conserve battery and leaned back in my seat. It was only when the darkness fully settled in that I realized how quiet it was. Not the usual quiet of night where you still hear wind, crickets, distant traffic. No, this was complete, suffocating silence. I exhaled. The sound felt too loud. The temperature had dropped fast. Even though it had been a blistering 90 degrees earlier, the desert night chill was creeping in. I rubbed my arms and tried to get comfortable, but unease was already crawling into my bones. Still, I told myself, just close your eyes. Morning will come. Someone will drive by. I don't know how long I sat like that before I heard it. Knock. I froze. It was soft, subtle, like something lightly tapping against metal. I turned my head slowly, my pulse spiking. Nothing. I swallowed, heart hammering. Probably just cooling metal, right? Cars make noises when they settle. That had to be it. Then I heard it again. Knock. Knock. This time from the passenger side. I shot upright and fumbled for my phone, using the dim glow of the screen to glance around. Through the windows, I saw nothing but black. I flicked the headlights back on. The beams stretched forward, illuminating nothing but the cracked pavement and an endless stretch of road. I was alone. I stared through the windshield, listening. Silence. I released a shaky breath. Okay, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I imagined it. I checked the time again. 12:42 a.m. Shifting in my seat, I considered my options. I could try to sleep, but every nerve in my body was alert now, waiting for another sound. I could get out and check around the car, but the idea of stepping into that vast, empty night made my skin crawl. Something about the darkness felt wrong. Like it wasn't just darkness, but something watching. A crunch. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was the sound of footsteps on gravel. Slow. Measured. Close. My breath hitched. I turned my head toward the driver's side window. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and pale. Beyond that, nothing. Just the night swallowing the desert whole. I strained to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. The footsteps stopped. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Something about the silence was worse than the sound itself. Like whatever was out there wanted me to know it was there, but not see it. I reached down and locked the doors. The soft click sounded deafening. Then, thud, a heavy impact against the trunk. I jumped so hard my knees slammed into the dashboard. I spun around, staring at the back window, my breath caught in my throat. The trunk was barely visible in the dim glow of the dome light, but I saw nothing. And yet something had hit the car. Not a light knock this time. This was deliberate. Hard. The kind of sound something alive makes. I waited, chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. The seconds crawled by, each one stretching endlessly. Then, just as my nerves reached a breaking point, "Talp, talp, talp," right outside the passenger door. I lost it. Fumbling, I switched on the high beams. The desert exploded into view. Every cactus, every rock now bathed in artificial light. There was nothing there. Nothing. But I knew what I'd heard. I swallowed hard, gripping my phone with sweaty fingers. I opened the camera and flipped it to the front-facing view, holding it up like a mirror to see behind me. For a moment, the screen showed only the back seat. Then, the tiniest shift, a shadow, something inside the car. I turned, but there was nothing there. The phone slipped from my hands, landing on the floor with a dull thud. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in short gasps. I stared at the empty back seat, heart threatening to burst from my chest. Then, from somewhere outside, a whisper. Not words, not a voice I could understand, just a sound so faint it barely existed, like something breathing against the glass. I squeezed my eyes shut. It's not real. It's not real. I checked the time again. 1:12 a.m. The night was far from over. The silence stretched, pressing against me like a physical force. My breath was the only sound in the car, shallow and uneven. I stared at the rearview mirror, fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. The reflection showed the empty back seat, the pale glow of my phone screen on the floor, the red glow of the taillights casting faint light onto the pavement behind me. Nothing moved, but I knew something had been there. I leaned forward, trying to slow my breathing. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my mind, strung tight with exhaustion and fear, was turning shadows into shapes that weren't really there. Knock! I jerked so violently that my knee slammed into the dashboard. The sound was louder this time. Not a soft tap like before, but a firm knock, as if someone was rapping their knuckles against the car door. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment. Cooling metal, I told myself. Desert air messing with the frame. Then, thud. The whole car shook. I gasped, twisting toward the passenger side window, but there was nothing but darkness beyond the glass. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed, breathing hard. My fingers fumbled for the door lock again, pressing it down even though I knew I had already locked it. A useless action, but it made me feel like I had some kind of control. I grabbed my phone off the floor, heart hammering, and turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the interior of the car, then the window, then out into the empty desert beyond. Nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of road and the black silhouettes of cacti against the night sky. The wind shifted outside, or at least I thought it was wind. It didn't sound quite right. More like something whispering through the cracks in the darkness, curling around the car, pressing close. I turned the flashlight toward the rearview mirror. For a second, just a fraction of a second, I saw movement. A flicker of something pale and thin, slipping just out of sight. I twisted around in my seat, my breath caught in my throat. My flashlight beam bounced across the empty back seat, then the rear windshield. The red taillights bathed the ground behind me in an eerie glow. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I locked my gaze on the rearview mirror again, my pulse hammering. The road stretched on behind me, a Tulane void in the middle of the desert. There was no movement, no sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. I forced myself to sit back, trying to steady my breathing. I had to stay rational, had to think this through. My phone had no service, and I was miles from anywhere. Walking wasn't an option. I had to wait for morning. That was it. Just make it to sunrise. I glanced at the time. 1:37 a.m. I let out a shaky breath and turned off the flashlight to conserve battery. The moment the light disappeared, bang! Something slammed into the roof of the car. I let out a strangled yell, hands flying to the wheel out of instinct. My whole body tensed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Another bang, this time against the trunk. The car rocked slightly. I turned the key in the ignition, knowing it wouldn't start, but desperation made me try anyway. The engine clicked uselessly. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel. Come on, come on. Bang. The sound came from the driver's side now. I twisted in my seat, heart hammering. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight again, flipping it on and shining it out the window. The light bounced off empty desert. The knock stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but my own gasping breaths. Then, slowly, deliberately, a long, deep scrape ran along the roof of the car, like nails dragging over metal. My stomach twisted. The sound slithered from one side of the roof to the other, agonizingly slow. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening around the phone as if the thin device could somehow protect me. The scraping stopped. Silence. I turned off the flashlight again, pulse throbbing behind my eyes. I was losing it. That had to be it. I was tired, stranded, anxious. My brain was playing tricks on me. I needed to rest. I reclined the driver's seat slightly, still gripping my phone. The weight of exhaustion settled over me, dragging me into a restless half-sleep. But every time I drifted too deep, a soft thump would jolt me awake. A sound like fingers tapping against the window. A slow, deliberate sound, like someone waiting, watching. I don't know how long I spent in that state, half awake listening. Every time I opened my eyes, the darkness outside seemed heavier. The desert wasn't just dark anymore. It was thick, like something was pressing against the edges of my vision. I checked the time, 3:12 a.m., still hours to go before sunrise. I pressed my head against the seat, swallowing hard. Just a little longer, just until daylight. The sound started again. Not a knock this time, a whisper. My eyes snapped open. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the car, the back seat. I turned my head slowly, the air thick with something unseen, something pressing in, suffocating. The darkness behind me felt different, heavy, like it wasn't just empty space, but something waiting there. I lifted my phone with shaking fingers, turning on the screen to use it as a mirror. The glow illuminated the car's interior. The empty passenger seat, the dashboard, the back seat, a shape, something thin and pale crouched in the shadows, just out of focus. The second I saw it, it moved, a blur of motion, a shifting of darkness. I spun around, sucking in a breath, but the back seat was empty. Nothing but my jacket crumpled in the corner. Nothing but silence pressing against my eardrums. Nothing but the overwhelming sense that whatever I had just seen, it wanted me to know it was there. I clutched my phone, my breath shuddering out in uneven gasps. Outside the car, the desert stretched on, endless and black. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of the headlights, something was waiting. I don't remember falling asleep. One moment, I was staring into the darkness outside, my heart pounding, my fingers wrapped so tightly around my phone that my knuckles ached. The next, my head jerked up, and I realized I had drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. Something was different. The air inside the car felt thick, suffocating, like I was inhaling something invisible, but heavy. I blinked hard, trying to clear the haze from my brain. The headlights were still on, their beams stretching weakly into the void ahead. But something was wrong. The darkness beyond the headlights had changed. It wasn't just empty anymore. There were shapes standing in it. At first, they were barely distinguishable from the night itself. Vague, human-like outlines that seemed to waver and shift, almost blending into the black. But as my vision sharpened, I saw them more clearly. Figures, dozens of them, all standing motionless along the edge of the light, watching. My body locked up. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. The figures just stood there, just beyond the reach of my headlights, surrounding the car in a wide, silent ring. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking violently. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the windshield. The figures didn't move. Their bodies were unnaturally still, like mannequins frozen in place. The light didn't illuminate them the way it should have. It barely seemed to touch them, like they were absorbing it, like they weren't really there. My breathing came in shallow gasps. I turned the light toward the driver's side window, and that's when I saw it. One of them was right there, not at the edge of the darkness, not 20 feet away, right next to my car. I barely stopped myself from screaming. It was standing inches from the glass, its face, if you could call it that, tilted downward, watching me. But it wasn't a face. Not really. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just smooth, featureless skin stretched too tightly over the shape of a head. The thing stood there motionless, close enough that if the glass weren't there, I could reach out and touch it. I scrambled back against my seat, my mind screaming at me to do something. I reached down and locked the doors. The sharp click of the locks echoed in the silence. The figure didn't react. It didn't try to break in, didn't flinch. It just pressed its face against the window. The glass fogged where it touched. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. Slowly, the figure raised one of its hands and placed it flat against the window. I could see the fingers, long and thin, the skin stretched unnaturally tight over the knuckles. There were no fingernails. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, in the reflection of the passenger side window, I saw another one, and another, and another. The figures were closing in. The glass around me was covered in them now. Faceless things pressing against the windows, their hands, their smooth, empty faces fogging up the glass. A small sound escaped my throat, half gasp, half sob. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was some kind of hallucination, that I was still dreaming, that I would wake up in my bed and laugh about this in the morning. Then the radio crackled to life. A burst of static. Loud, wrong. Then a voice. Low, garbled, saying my name. My blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the car. I turned my head in slow, jerky movements, my breath barely passing through my lips. The radio screen was dark. The car was dead. There was no power. But the voice, my voice, whispered from the speakers. I heard myself speaking, but the words were slurred, distorted, like a recording played backward. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out. But it wasn't just a voice anymore. Something was knocking on the roof. Not a random thud, not the sound of settling metal. Rhythmic, deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence. Then 3 more. I wanted to scream, wanted to cover my eyes, wanted to crawl into myself and disappear. The figures outside pressed closer. The windows started to bend inward. Not break, just warp, like the glass wasn't glass anymore, like it was soft, pliable. My chest heaved, my vision blurred. I had to get out, had to. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The radio cut off. The knocking ceased. The figures outside were gone. One blink, they were there. The next, nothing. I sat there, shaking, staring out at the empty desert. The glass was still fogged from where they had pressed against it. The warped windows slowly settled back into their original shape. The only evidence that any of it had happened. I took a deep breath, then another. Then I checked the time, 3:57 a.m., and I still had hours until dawn. I couldn't stop shaking. The silence outside was worse than the sounds had been. I kept expecting another knock, another figure pressing its faceless head against the glass, another whisper curling through the dead radio. But nothing came, just the endless stretch of highway, the empty desert, and the weight of something unseen pressing down on me like a hand wrapped around my throat. I checked the time, 3:57 a.m. Had the last hour only lasted minutes? Or had it stretched on for days? I had no sense of time anymore. My mind felt loose, unanchored, like it was slipping out of sync with reality. I needed to get out of here. But stepping into that darkness, no, something was out there. Something wanted me to leave the car. I locked my arms around my knees, pressing myself against the seat, watching the road ahead. A flicker of light in the distance. I straightened up, heart hammering. Headlights. A car. It was small, probably a sedan, far away, barely more than a pinprick of gold against the darkness. But it was moving. Someone was coming. My breath hitched with relief. I scrambled for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. I waved it frantically, the tiny glow flashing against the windshield as I tried to signal them. They kept driving. Closer. Closer. I could almost make out the shape of the car now, the way the light cut through the black. I unbuckled my seatbelt, ready to throw myself out, to wave my arms, to scream for help if I had to. Then, the headlights flickered and vanished. The road ahead was empty. I froze, my body locking up. I hadn't seen the car turn, hadn't seen it pull off the road. 1 second it was there, the next gone. The nausea came fast, a lurching sickness twisting deep in my stomach, something inside me instinctively recoiling. The desert was wrong. I could feel it now, like the road, the sky, the horizon itself wasn't real. Just an illusion stretched thin over something else. Something waiting beneath. A presence that had always been here, long before I stopped my car. And it was awake now. I squeezed my eyes shut. Not real. Not real. Not real. A gust of cold air rushed through the car. I froze. The windows were shut. The doors were locked. The air shouldn't be moving, but I felt it cold and unnatural swirling around my ankles, creeping up my spine. Then, a whisper. It was soft, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakable. I snapped my head around, breath shallow. The back seat was empty, but the whispering was inside the car. I clenched my hands into fists, forcing myself to breathe, my heartbeat a wild, erratic drum against my ribs. Then another sound. Tick. My eyes flicked to the dashboard. The clock. I watched, horrified, as the numbers began moving backward. 3:55 a.m., 3:54 a.m., 3:53 a.m. My breath hitched. It was undoing time. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady myself, but my fingers were numb, my skin cold as ice. 3:50 a.m. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from a single direction anymore. They were everywhere. Inside the vents, under the seats, crawling through the dashboard speakers, curling into my ears. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them, pressing into my skull, slithering through my thoughts. Something was in here with me, something that had been waiting for me to be alone, to be vulnerable, to stop moving. I grabbed the key, twisting it violently in the ignition. The engine sputtered. For a second, hope flared in my chest. Then, nothing. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, biting back a scream. 3:42 a.m. The voices, no, not voices, things grew closer. I could feel them now, a weight pressing into the seat beside me, a shift in the air behind my head, a presence, unseen but unbearably close. Something leaning in. I turned my head. There was nothing there. Just the empty passenger seat. Just the silent back seat. Just a single breath of air against my ear. I lunged for my phone, my fingers fumbling against the screen, shaking too hard to hold it properly. I flipped the camera into selfie mode, angling it toward the back seat. The screen lit up. I nearly dropped it. Something was sitting behind me. Not fully visible. Not solid. Just the faintest outline of a figure, a warped distortion in the air. A thing that shouldn't exist. The moment I saw it, it moved. I felt it shift forward, felt the weight of its presence press into my shoulder, cold and unbearable. I turned, expecting to see something, but the back seat was empty. The whispers stopped, the clock froze, and the air felt lighter. Not safe, but different. I exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to my forehead. Outside, the darkness was beginning to change. Not much, not all at once, but I could see the slightest hint of gray breaking at the edges of the horizon. Dawn, a faint glow, like the world was taking its first slow breath. I barely dared to hope. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then, a sharp, screeching sound outside. I whipped my head around. Deep, jagged claw marks carved into the hood of my car. Fresh. The metal peeled back in long, curved slashes, as if something had crawled over it. I swallowed hard. The sun was rising now. The desert no longer looked like an abyss ready to swallow me. The road stretched ahead, normal again. But whatever had been out there, whatever had been inside, it had left its mark, and it had let me live. This time, the sun was rising. I didn't move. I was afraid to. Afraid that if I blinked, if I shifted even an inch, the shadows would come creeping back. That the figures would return, pressing their faceless heads against the glass, whispering in voices I couldn't understand. But the night was over. The desert, so empty and infinite in the darkness, was just desert now. A vast stretch of dust and rock, the kind of place that felt forgotten by time. I barely noticed the approaching car at first. The distant growl of an engine was almost surreal, like it didn't belong in this world anymore. But it was real. A vehicle was coming up the highway, kicking up dust in the early morning light. A sheriff's car. I stared, my brain sluggish, my body too stiff from terror to react. The car slowed as it neared, then pulled off onto the shoulder behind mine. The driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out, middle-aged, heavy-set, with sun-worn skin and tired eyes beneath the brim of his hat. His uniform was dusty, like he'd been on the road for hours. He stood there for a moment, looking at me. Then his gaze shifted to my car, to the claw marks etched deep into the hood. He sighed. Then he said something that sent a fresh wave of cold through my veins. "You stopped here in vain." I blinked at him, trying to process the words, but my brain wasn't working right. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. He didn't seem surprised by my state. "Come on," he said, walking back toward his car. "Let's get you out of here." I barely remember climbing out of my car. My legs were numb, my movements unsteady, like I had been trapped in a frozen state for hours. The moment I stepped onto the road, my knees nearly buckled. The sheriff caught my arm. "Easy now," he muttered, like he had done this before. Like I was just another unfortunate idiot who had stopped in the wrong place at the wrong time. I glanced over my shoulder. The claw marks on the hood seemed darker in the morning light, like the metal had been burned where it was torn. I forced myself to look away. The sheriff guided me to his car and had me sit in the passenger seat while he fetched a red plastic gas can from the trunk. I barely noticed him filling up my tank, my mind still lost somewhere between fear and exhaustion. A few minutes later, he climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine. "I'll take you to town," he said. "You can rest there." I swallowed, my throat raw. My voice came out hoarse. What was that?" He didn't answer at first, just kept driving, eyes on the road. "You're lucky," he said finally. I let out a shaky breath. "Lucky?" He nodded. "Most folks who stop there, they don't make it to morning." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" He exhaled through his nose, like he was debating how much to say. Then he shook his head. "Some roads take you places you shouldn't go, and some roads don't want you to leave." I stared at him, my pulse rising again. "Then why does this road even exist?" I rasped. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "It doesn't." 20 minutes later, we reached a town. I didn't remember seeing any signs for it on the way in. No highway exits. No indication that civilization existed out here. But there it was, a small, dusty place with a handful of buildings, a gas station, and a motel. The sheriff pulled into the gas station lot and shut off the engine. "Go inside," he told me. "Get some water. Rest. Then get the hell out of here." I turned to him, gripping the seat. "What is this place?" Again, that long pause. That hesitation. Finally, he said, "Know where you should be." I swallowed hard and nodded. I stepped out of the car, my legs still unsteady. The sheriff waited until I was inside the gas station before pulling away, his car disappearing down the highway. The attendant behind the counter, a wiry man with deep wrinkles and tired eyes, watched me cautiously as I approached. "You all right?" he asked. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I didn't know how to answer. The man glanced out the window toward my car. He must have seen the marks, because his expression darkened. "You stopped on that road, didn't you?" I tensed. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're not the first." I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling. "What is that place?" The attendant shook his head. Best not to ask. I wanted to scream. Instead, I grabbed a water bottle, threw some cash on the counter, and walked back to my car. I didn't want to be in this town any longer than I had to. I drove until the town disappeared in my rearview mirror. Only then did I stop on the side of the road and pull up my GPS. I needed to know where I had been, where that place was. I zoomed in on the map, followed the highway. Nothing. The town wasn't there. The gas station wasn't there. Even the stretch of road where I had stopped wasn't there. Like it had never existed. I stared at my screen, my pulse drumming in my ears. I turned in my seat and looked back at the road behind me. It stretched on, empty and endless, like it was waiting, like it was watching. I shivered. Then I put the car in drive and didn't stop until I crossed the state line. I never took that highway again. I never tried to find that town. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and my mind drifts back to that place, I hear it, a soft, steady sound. Knock, knock, knock. And I know that road hasn't forgotten me, and it never will.